This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and Upsnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sherry Horn Hassan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, coming to you on November 1st, 2018, from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder to everyone that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. Today, my guest is Mitchell Lewis, professional financial and health astrologer, lecturer, and author, here to provide his astrological assessment of next week's U.S. midterms elections. I'm really excited to get to that, and I'll be introducing Mitch properly in a few. But first, here's this week's Astro news you can use. Well, Mercury moved into truth-telling Sagittarius late on October 30th, or early on the 31st, depending on your time zone, and Venus in Scorpio opposed Uranus in Taurus, and then retreated back into its own sign of Libra on the 31st, which was just yesterday. The two planets remain in opposition, however, Venus and Uranus, through to next week's November 6th midterm elections and November 7th Scorpio New Moon. Today, on November 1st, Jupiter trines wounded healer Chiron, and Venus will trine Chiron on November 3rd, and the Scorpio sun forms a trine of its own to Neptune late on November 5th or early on the 6th, depending on your time zone. Also on November 6th, the day again of the U.S. midterm elections, which obviously is the subject of this interview, so you're going to hear that term a lot. Uranus retrograde will re-enter Aries until March 6th, and though it stations direct in Aries on January 6th. So, and January 6th will be just a day after the Capricorn new moon and solar eclipse. So what does it all mean? Well, first, it pays to remember that between now and November 7th, which again is the day after the midterms and the day of the Scorpio new moon, we're still in the waning phases of October 24th Taurus full moon, which in retrospect clearly triggered what I'm going to diplomatically call social unrest. Surely anyone who hasn't heard at this point about the 14 pipe bombs mailed to former and current politicians, business people, and celebrities who've spoken out coincidentally against Trump's policies since he's been in office must be living under a rock. Now, the first package was discovered the day of the Taurus full moon on October 24th. And also since then, as many of us know, 11 Jewish people were gunned down during prayer services on the Sabbath at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's Tree of Life Synagogue on October 27th, and 2 African Americans were shot dead in a randomly racist act or acts of violence in and near Kroger supermarket in Jeffersontown, Kentucky. During the former ordeal at the synagogue, a lone gunman armed with an automatic weapon shot people engaged in prayer or the act of entering a house of worship. And this started and ended just a few hours before the Taurus new moon became exact. According to, no, I'm sorry, that's not true. I was confusing. I see I was writing something else. This was on October 27th, and the Taurus full moon was on the 24th. according to the New York Times, I'm going to quote here, one of the officers was quoted probably off of the police scanner that reporters can hear when they are reporting on a sudden incident such as this. This is a quote: "Suspects talking about all these Jews need to die," an officer said. "The suspect keeps telling about killing Jews. He doesn't want any of them to live." And shortly afterwards, the suspect finally surrendered. He was wounded and he was crawling towards the officers who were trying to get him out. Also, according to the New York Times, about the other incident in Jeffersontown, and this is a quote: "The police in Jeffersontown said they received reports of shots fired at the supermarket around 3 p.m. Wednesday." And this was the day of the Taurus full moon, and quickly sent officers to the scene. Investigators said that after Mr. Bush, who was the assailant, entered the supermarket, he fired multiple rounds at a male victim. He then exited and fired multiple rounds at a female victim whom he encountered in the parking lot. Both shooting victims declared dead at the scene. Mr. Bush, and I thought this was interesting, then encountered an armed citizen who, quote, engaged the suspect with gunfire in the parking lot, according to the police chief. And Steve Zinninger told Wave 3 News that his father confronted the gunman at one point during the encounter, brandishing a gun of his own and telling that he would not shoot if the gunman did not shoot him. Mr. Zinninger said the gunman told his father, "Whites don't kill whites," and moved on. The gunman then ran, but he was soon caught by the police on a main thoroughfare nearby, end quote. So make no mistake, because now looking at the astrology, right? Anything that's meant to blow up bears the markings of Uranus, regardless of what sign it's currently transiting, and or Mars. Mars was just past a square to Mercury and waxing into a square with Jupiter at the last new moon, denoting that a message was bound to make a big splash on the news when the Taurus new moon met with Uranus at that time. So we're still being asked all the way through to next week's election to release any of the sun signs' negative energies that were highlighted by the last full moon lunation. Taurus full moon lunation. So what are the negative traits of the Scorpio sign? Negative Scorpio energies include distrust, disempowerment, or giving away your own power, or being, having your power compromised away from you. Scorpio is other people's money, so dark money, or playing fast and loose with other people's resources. Banks and brokerages, anyone? Mortgages, yeah. Change just because. Scorpio doesn't like things to remain the same, and sometimes he just wants them to change because. Shadow side fears and behaviors, including betrayal, etc. And these are the themes that came into play when the Taurus full moon, which conjoined with Uranus and Taurus, reflected the light of the Scorpio sun back onto itself for the purpose of greater illumination. Meanwhile, this illumination reminded the Scorpio sun of Taurus's higher traits of constancy, dependability, serenity, harmony, and finding peace and happiness through our individual and collective definitions of value. Inherent in those definitions lie a good part of what motivates us as we move forward toward co-creating our own futures, especially if we choose to do it through astrological insight. So anything we fear may be hidden. Agendas, plots to betray us out of our money, sexual affairs, or other secrets and taboo subjects like death, etc. We should acknowledge stems from our internal energies that often get projected out onto others, who then mistakenly appear to be the true source of these fears. So November 8th, which is next Wednesday, next November. Boy, I'm sorry. I have some of this written, and I see I made mistakes. It's November 7th, Scorpio New Moon, at 15 degrees, 11 minutes, and which occurs at 8:02 a.m. Pacific time and 11:02 a.m. Eastern time, again on November 7th, Mercury in Sagittarius tells us that it's time to plant seeds for our evolutionary journey on a more conscious level, because when the moon meets the sun at that degree in Scorpio, we are going to have the opportunity again to become conscious of that which we fear, number one, and number two, to secondarily understand that when we repress our fears, we project them out and they come at us in the form of others. So at the new moon, the luminaries are also waxing toward a sextile to Pluto, which is one of Scorpio's rulers at this time. And this denotes that we all have opportunities to further empower ourselves regardless of our current situations. So how do we do that? Well, by facing our shadows. Now, this is always easier said than done, but this sextile undoubtedly presents easier rather than harder opportunities for us to peek under that rock that we may not want to do in normal times and to see into the darkness that lies beneath it. Both luminaries also will trine Neptune at this lumination, and Neptune is the king of empathy. And this reveals to us, or can reveal to us, that our path towards evolutionary change, both personally and collectively, can include compassion for both ourselves and for others. So shining a light on, scorpionic darkness is what occurred at the October 24th Taurus full moon. And as we've all witnessed through the events that I've mentioned and others that have occurred within the collective and or in your personal lives following that lunation. So now we want to ask ourselves, so where has that light revealed something hidden in our lives now that we're in the waning phase still of the Taurus full moon until we get to November 7th? And do you have the guts to face it now? Because, by doing so, you diminish the power of fear or of, others holding something fearful over you. And that can be fear of anything. So whatever we repress, as I said, gets projected out, comes back at us in the form of another or others through their behaviors. And we manifest our greatest fears most tellingly through our relationships, be they with lovers, family, friends, colleagues, authority figures, etc. So relationships factor heavily again into the upcoming Scorpio new moon, just as they did at the last lunation, because Venus retrograde on its own sign of Libra since yesterday, October 31st, still technically opposes Uranus, which retrogrades back into Aries at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on Election Day, November 6th. Where do our individual values clash with those of the collective, and how do we express ourselves about what we value now? Mercury in Sagittarius is waxing towards a square to Jupiter on both Election Day and at the Scorpio new moon, and that reminds us that that we may be impatient, we may want to get things over with, but it is the luminaries trine to Neptune that tells us we should slow down and have compassion. But Mercury also actually is waxing into a square to Mercury in Sagittarius, waxing into a square to Neptune in Pisces. And this reminds us that all that we hear is not necessarily true, and all that we say may become exaggerated or somehow distorted. Neptune is the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion. So this means that any messages now it's highly likely we can mishear, misinterpret, or misunderstand, and likewise be misheard, have what we say be misinterpreted or misunderstood, and finally that we may hear only what we want to hear and not what's actually being said. So this is a particularly important point to keep in mind as we head into Election Day. Jupiter enters its own sign of Sagittarius on November 8th, And I'm going to speak about this more now with my guest, who I think I've kept waiting long enough, and I'm now going to introduce. So noted New York-based professional astrologer Mitchell Scott Lewis specializes in financial and medical chart interpretation and has been reading charts for more than 2 decades. Throughout the 90s, he worked on the floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange and became well known as an astrological trader and market analyst. His international clientele include leading financiers, renowned entertainment industry figures, health professionals, and people from all walks of life. Mitchell has been quoted in Barron's, the New York Daily News, and many other publications. A regular guest on the national radio show Coast to Coast AM with Greg Nouri, Mitchell discusses world events and predicts financial and political events. He does so as well in his regular monthly newsletter, Living by Starlight, in lectures, and via numerous appearances on national television and radio. Most recently, Mitchell predicted the precipitous drop in oil prices and the resulting steep decline in the ruble. In addition, he's accurately predicted a number of world events, including the rise of oil prices in the 1990s, the collapse of the housing market, and the '08 stock market crash, which he precisely told within days of its occurrence, more than a year in advance. Mitchell is a frequent lecturer. He lectured last at one of the largest astrological conferences in the world called the United Astrologers Conference, or UAC, in May in Chicago in 2018. And I know that he's due to be a lecturer at the NCGR Philly chapter in June, which is still a ways away, but I wanted to mention it anyway, since I like to publicize that group, since I am a board member for them. So that will be June 23rd, 2019, for any who are like me, and they like to put it on their calendar way in advance. Also an author of the Starlight Detective Agency mystery series, novels that highlight protagonist astrologer detective David Lowell and feature New York City as a backdrop, Mitchell's books have developed a cult following among savvy mystery buffs. The third in the series, Evil in the First House, was published by Poisoned Pen Press recently, and the fourth book in his series, Satan in the Second House, will be available soon. All right, welcome, Mitch. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good, Sherry. How are you?
I'm good. I'm not too far from you. I'm in Jersey, Central Jersey, and I think we have 72 on our thermometers today. So I'm hoping it's nice.
It's a beautiful global warming day.
Yeah. Except for those of us who remember, Halloween's where it was like 32 degrees. We're kind of not that upset. We're upset in the big picture, but not in the microcosm,
That's the difference, of course.
Yeah.
As they say, all politics is local, all weather is local.
Yeah, true.
But Sherry, we're heading into obviously a crossroads in human history that could go either way. I try to be an optimist. I have a lot of Sag in my chart and a very heavily aspected Jupiter, so I look for the good. But the Brazil just elected a president who is going to cut down as much of the rainforest as he possibly can to expand business ventures, and we have a president who denies that global warming exists, and so on.
Well, it's interesting because I was just going to launch right into asking you about your opinion of the elections, but you just brought up another thought that I don't want to forget, which is that I just saw this morning an NPR, I think it was NPR, PBS, and Marist poll that said young people were going to turn out in greater numbers in this election, and that I think it was 42% of them disagree with Trump's policies. But I think perhaps when we talk about issues like climate change and it being denied by our current administration and president, that it's the young people who are going to have to, or who will actually vote based on that more so than older people. But,
well, we're praying that they come out, and that Taylor Swift had some influence over them. I don't know.
Well,
listen, an election that pits a country rock star against a reality TV show star. He speaks
Yeah.
rather strongly about America's character and values.
Well, I'll tell you something, and this is off the subject, but since we're going that way, I have a son who's 23. He's my only child, and I watched him and his peers become what by my estimation, the first generation that could watch nothing but cartoons all the way into adulthood. In other words, The Simpsons and things like that started before his birth, and shows like Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, that gave younger people politics through comedy.
Yeah.
That's another thing. So it's a very interesting thing because on one hand, I think they might go towards dissociation, and check out.
Well, but Sherry, as the old argument goes, it's the message, not the media.
No, but I'm saying, on the other hand, they're much more savvy, because of that. Politics through comedy seems to hit home more, and the other is a different issue, I think, but so much of the cartoon show, like South Park, for example. It's
Yeah, I know, but I still prefer people who read books and make their decisions based on more information than they're going to get from The Simpsons. But I do understand your point, and certainly we have a culture that people text; they don't even write emails anymore. It's too much. An emoji, how are you? And that's pretty much it,
I know. I always see people. I laugh because my son, who has a minor, I just graduated, a minor in English Lit, but he's the only person I know with all that texting because I'm an editor, so you notice those things right away. He spells out okay, but he doesn't do okay instead of K, because most of his friends would say K. He says OKAY. And I'm like, okay, there's a little bit of an anomaly. But anyway.
Well, that's some compromise. Anyway, let's get into the election.
Absolutely. What are you seeing as the astrological indicators, especially with Uranus retrograde moving back into Aries early on the Pacific and then the mid-afternoon here in the eastern part of the country on election day, and the moon phase being in the dark of the moon? What are you seeing that's going to happen?
Right. I recently put out a piece through the newsletter and on Facebook about the election. Mm-hmm. And while certainly things are changing day to day, as seems to happen in American politics, it is the dark of the Scorpio moon. And as you know, the dark of the moon is very often the end of the matter. A number of people I know died on the dark of the moons, and I know a lot of businesses. I had a friend who was a Broadway producer, and he tells me the date of his play is going to open. I said to him, it's the dark of the moon. How can you possibly do that? You have a friend who's a professional astrologer. Why wouldn't you ask me? Well, that's the date we picked. The play opened up. It got excellent reviews, and it closed and cost $4 million.
Wow.
And so we're on the dark of the moon in this election. And, America's chart, by the way, am a firm believer in the Sagittarius ascendant. I also lecture on that quite a bit. I get into lots of fights with some people at the NCGR about it, but it's so obvious to me. I mean, first of all, the simple, belief in manifest destiny, that America is by God's will supposed to grow as large as the landmass will allow. There is only one sign of the zodiac that thinks that way, and that's expansive Sagittarius. Right. We also invented the cowboy, which is Sagittarius, and if we were a Gemini ascendant, we would have stopped growing around the Mississippi River and said, well, that's big enough. Right. And we have Uranus near our seventh house, not near our ascendant. It's our, we fought a war with Germany and Japan, and 15 years later, they were our biggest trading partners. It's our relationships that change. Anyway, just to clear that up a little bit, with that Sagittarius ascendant, what we're looking at, as you know, we're heading into 2020. So we look ahead a few years, and that's going to be an incredibly explosive period. There's a very good chance that there will be assassinations at that time, as often happens in the 20-year cycle when Saturn and Jupiter conjunct, in 1840, 1860, 1880, 1900, 1920, 1940, every president that was elected at that 20-year period died in office. Now, Reagan got shot in the shoulder, and that configuration, which often occurs in the earth signs, occurred in the air signs, and Gemini rules the shoulders. So that's why he was shot there. And G.W. Bush, of course, managed to miss it altogether. But with the kind of events that are occurring and the anger and the built-up frustration and stress in our country, what happened recently is beyond tears. I mean, I obviously, it's too much to, in some ways, for people to handle, but it's simply the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be more, not less.
Well, let me ask you if you would just back up for a second. Do you have, and I don't know if you want to make a hard prediction, so I'm not forcing you to, but
no, I always make predictions, Sherry. Many of them are accurate. Occasionally, I'll be wrong, but I have no problem with that.
Right. I wonder if you see
go ahead.
The election if it's going to be a validation of this President Trump's time in office or the opposite.
Well, because of voter suppression, gerrymandering, all kinds of scorpionic hidden stuff that's going on. I recently read that Josh Hawley, who is the Attorney General in Missouri, he's running against Claire McCaskill. And he came out with ads claiming that he is going to save pre-existing conditions in healthcare. And of course, he is suing to overturn the ACA and to abolish pre-existing conditions. It's out and out blatant lying. Fear mandering as well about this invasion in the South that's coming up and all the rest of this nonsense.
Immigrants,
the great hordes that are coming here, these poor people who can't feed themselves, and they're, as it is, they're 1,000 miles from our border. They are dissipating. It's not absolute nonsense. But this is what people do. This is what politicians do. And Mr. Trump and his cohorts are simply blatant liars, and so they're going to try every trick in the book to try and make it happen. Some elections are going to swing in Trump's favor because of this, but many more aren't. I believe that the Democrats take over the House. I do not think they're going to get the Senate because of the way that things are lined up. But I do sense that the blue wave, which a couple of months ago we were sure of, and then things tipped because of Kavanaugh and back and forth, it's coming back into play. I had dinner last night with a Democratic worker, a guy who was hired by the Democratic Party for many things. He's a very prominent player in it all, and he's a good friend of mine, and we were talking about it all. And of course, he's as upset as anybody possibly could be, but he thinks that because of voter suppression in North Dakota and in Georgia and in Florida, they're going to do what they can. But the Democrats are going to win the House. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why they're going to win the House is because that's going to build up to the stress and the tension in 2020.
Okay.
If the Republicans held on to everything, well, the Democrats would still fight against it. But as you see, we have no power, not really. And in order to create the explosive situation that 2020 is implying, there's got to be a struggle. And the only time that people change is when they're in pain. Right. And I see this in my own clients as well as in, the collective. And we are in a period of incredible, beyond belief, frustration and anguish and pain. And the young people, I was half joking about Taylor Swift, but not really. Even Kanye West came out the other day and said, "Oh, I've been used by political people. I never meant any of that."
Everybody's he got back on his meds.
Well, he's going to, why? Because people are going to stop buying his records. Come on, that's all that motivates people. He thought also it may very well be. I mean, does seem to have a chemical imbalance. Let's face facts.
Yeah.
Anyway, on election day, we have Mercury by transit in opposition to America's Uranus. We have Saturn in opposition to America's Jupiter. Mars is in conjuncting America's Mercury and coming up to the conjunct to our moon. And in the sky, Venus is in opposition to Uranus. Now, all this Uranus energy implies change.
Yeah,
and I'm inclined to believe that we are, in fact, heading into a period which will create even more Uranian energy. For example, the House perhaps trying to impeach Mr. Trump. I honestly don't think they're going to succeed. We've never managed to throw a president down.
Senate, no? Yeah.
Sorry?
Don't they need the Senate to complete that?
Well, of course.
Yeah,
Of course.
so it's not going to happen if it stays
No,
red.
it's not going to happen. And if they try to, again, from my point of view, if they actually spend the efforts for the next 2 years trying to impeach him, they're going to lose a lot of their support. I don't think that's where the efforts belong. I think the efforts belong pointing out what people need, helping people. And if you read my newsletters, we're heading into another crash. And
Well,
this
yeah,
crash,
I'm going to ask you about that. But before we get there, I want to ask you too. Just if we stay with politics for just a moment, I wanted to ask you if you think, based on the astrology, that we're heading into a period. How much Uranus in Taurus? Because when Uranus was last in Taurus, it was 1934 to 42. So clearly, the lead up to World War II, which was a huge period of increased nationalism and violence. And you just mentioned Brazil, and I go back to, I think it was even 2016, the Austrian, one of the nominees. He lost by 49 point something, and he was a fascist. And we see it in many other places, Duterte and stuff like that. So do you see very strong parallels between last time?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, last time Uranus was in Taurus. That's the question.
Well, there's 2 points I want to make. First, the most telling thing that has happened in the last period of time is that Merkel is stepping down in Germany.
Yes, I saw that too.
And she is the most stabilizing force in the European Union. Now, opening up the German borders to 1 million or more refugees, I won't even get into personal feelings about that, but certainly that has given rise to the right wing. And it was overwhelming. I also frankly believe that Putin has stirred the fires in Syria because he knows that this will destabilize Europe. And that the refugees coming in, he just wants it to be worse and worse. So the European Union gets weaker. That makes his position stronger. These people are not playing with a fair game.
Right.
So now, another thing is that it's very tempting in astrology because we all study the same things. All of us, we go to each other's lectures and whatnot. And I did a lecture for the New York NCGR chapter along with Michael Luton was there and John Marcus Sala and somebody else. And we were all talking about Uranus entering Taurus. And it's very tempting to go back and say, well, the last time this happened, but we live in a different world. It's 84 years later. The parallels are certainly there, yes. But remember, in 1934, Roosevelt began his New Deal.
Right.
And he began Social Security and unemployment benefits and the TVA, and he put millions of Americans back to work. And now all of those programs are being threatened one more time by the Republican Party, the same party that fought against him in 1934. And 35, 36, and 37.
Right.
Also, I like to bring the stock markets and the economy into this kind of a discussion because it's all connected.
Right.
When in 1929 the stock market crashed, of course, and it took a great deal of oomph out of the world. But in 1931, the market dropped far more than it did in 29. The difference was that by 1931, volume in the markets was lessened because a lot of people had been wiped out.
Wiped out, yeah.
But if you had bought the stock market in 1931 and held it, it went up for 6 years in the middle of the worst depression the world has ever seen. 25% unemployment in this country alone. People living on, in cardboard boxes. And the stock market was up for 6 years. It wasn't until the Republicans took over the Congress and demanded that Roosevelt balance the budget that created what's called the Roosevelt recession. And the only thing that got us out of that was the Second World War. So all this is connected. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've read a few articles and talked to a few people. It's like the something I read a while ago or saw on PBS maybe was that there's like 84% of the American public, that might be a little high, but it was definitely 80 something, that doesn't even invest in the stock market. Or the financial markets at all. So when the stock market goes up, and I think this is particularly relevant now because of Citizens United Supreme Court decision and because of our growing disparity between rich and poor, that the market is it really an indicator of economic health?
No, the stock market is an indicator of the stock market. That's all it's an indicator of.
Right. So if the market falls, how does that affect people who aren't invested in the market?
Well, there's a difference between the market falling and the market crashing. What we're looking at now is a correction. The markets are very volatile, which one would expect with Uranus entering Taurus. The volatility began a while ago. And people who say that we're in a bull market, they don't understand. They do not look at charts properly, or they probably don't look at the chart of the Dow or the New York Stock Exchange at all. We're not in a bull market. We're in a sideways market. And we've been there for quite some time. The last new high that was made was on the full moon eclipse last January. Since then, it's just gone sideways, and it'll drop down 400, 500, 600 points. It'll come back up again 3 days later. It'll go back down again. It'll come back up again. Because I did this for so many years in New York in the Mercantile Exchange, and I studied these charts, and I did copious amounts of work. For one thing, it was my job, but also it interested me, fascinated me, how astrology and the markets correlate. Every time the market is about to change direction, it gets very, very volatile because people are looking for bargains. Market drops 600, 1,000 points. Everybody buys in, people who have money. Then it goes up and people get scared, and so they sell. Timing is so important if you're going to. One of the things that I do for my clients, and I do it like we all do. I talk about relationships, talk about moving, I talk about whatever the issues are. But because of my experience in the markets, a lot of people are coming to me now, especially a little bit older people. What should I do with my retirement fund? And I say to them, you've had growth since 2010. You have amazing growth in your retirement fund, in your personal funds, however you're dealing with your money. Why in God's name would you risk all of that for a little bit more on top when there's a chance that the whole thing could collapse? If I'm wrong and you lose a little bit on top, well, you can get back in a year or so. And if I'm right, which I tell you the truth, I'm absolutely sure I am, you're going to save your retirement fund. In 2008,
so is something where, like, you would say to the average person, like, just cash it out. Like, this is where if you're not a major player, right? But you have your IRA or whatever pension. Like, there's only so much people can do who have pensions and things like that, right?
You can move it. Legally, you can move it into cash, into bonds. You can do a lot of things with it. Okay. The problem is, Sherry, if you got a pain in your knee, you go to your doctor and you think he's a good doctor and he tells you what to do, you're going to do it. If you go to an investment counselor and you think that they're honest and they know what they're doing and they tell you what to do, chances are you're going to do it. The doctor isn't always right. He could have gotten D's in medical school. How the hell do you know? And your investment counselor, his job or her job is to get you to buy stocks because that's how they make money.
Right.
And I have a very hard time. A lot of younger traders and analysts have never dealt with a bear market. except in the crash of 2008. So they don't know how to trade a bear market. And all they're going to do, they're going to say to you, what are you worried about? The stocks went down 1,000 points. Oh, we're going to buy more Apple. We got it cheaper. We're going to put more money into lighting or whatever it is.
They've never seen Apple go out of business. Yeah.
Well, Apple isn't going to go out of business, but
No,
General Electric looks like it might.
Uh-huh.
And Sears is going out of business.
Oh, yeah.
And we are seeing all of these massive companies being completely wiped out, in part because, the internet and all the changes that have happened, but also in part because people they're not paying attention. Now, when I was brought onto the floor of the exchange, I was brought up there because cotton was trading $1.17 a pound. And even in the Civil War, it had never gone above the equivalent of $1 a pound. And they had tried everything they could. It was going limit up every single day for weeks. People were getting rich and people were getting wiped out. And they brought me up there to see if maybe I could find the top of the cotton market. And I did. I'll have to call it a little bit of luck or maybe my intuition. Because if I had been wrong on that trade, it would have been a very short career.
Right.
And it was the full moon in Libra, and I said, that's the top of the market. I intuitively said that cotton is ruled by Venus. And sure enough, that's exactly when it happened. And then it went limit down for 8 days. And we made a ton of money on this tiny little account. And then I started trading all these other things. So I see the correlation. What we're looking at now, and it's not just me, Sherry. I don't separate astrology from life. It's got a part of it. That's why I study nutrition and anatomy. If I'm going to do medical work, I talk with doctors and I talk with, acupuncturists and healers of all sorts. Well, I also have friends in the financial markets still, in the bond market in Chicago. And one of my clients is an immensely wealthy trader and recently came out with an article that absolutely correlated with what I've been saying. And whenever he and I both agree to something so far through the 10 or 12 years that I've known him, it always happens. He said, we're going to have a debt-fueled recession that will put the recession of 2008 to shame. Okay, they give away $1.5 trillion in a tax cut to the rich. They have to pay for it somehow. There's only two ways that they can pay for it. They can raid Social Security, which is illegal, but that doesn't mean they may not change the laws and make that happen. Or you raise interest rates. If I need more money and I'm not doing well, I have to raise the rates of the readings that I give so I can compensate because I have less clients. And this is how
client demand. Yeah.
So they're raising the interest rates, which is now making it more difficult for people to get mortgages, buy a new house, a car, pay their credit cards, their student debts.
Yes, I've read that student debt is going to be one of the causes too, not just the deficit and the government deficit, but the student debt. But let me ask.
One quick point. I don't know if you know, but in the late 70s, I believe, the government wiped out all student debts.
Well, that would be nice.
Well, they had no choice. We were in such a bad recession. That was an incredibly volatile period. And when I'm down in Philly, I will talk about that, of course, but I think I'd like to do an economic lecture for your group because first of all, it's fun. And I do it in a way that everybody can follow along. You don't need to know the economy, but you'll see how these things work in the different periods and over the last 100 years or so and what it was astrologically. But we'll talk about that. Anyway, you were going to say, I'm sorry.
Well, let me just ask you, because I think on the level of the average investor, people know for years, they invest in what do you call it, mutual funds. They're all still stocks, but what about, you mentioned the bond funds and individual bonds, if just the average person right now, are you saying everyone, in your opinion, because of what's going to happen, should just take the cash out, forego that little bit higher, like you said before, and keep what they've accrued, or move it to what's the story with the bonds?
Well, for one thing, the bond market is also quite volatile right now because all of this is connected in ways that it didn't used to be. I trade today differently than I did in the 90s because the world has changed. And in fact, I don't do commodities that much. I pretty much do stocks. My advice to all of my clients, I'm getting lots of calls about this and they want these kinds of readings. My advice is, especially, look, if you're 30 years old, well, you know what? Every time the market crashes, what people do, they buy it. And if you're not looking to take your money out for another 30, 35 years, then you deal with it differently.
Right.
But if you're 50, 55, 60 years old, it might take 10 years for your money to come back up, and you might need that money to live on.
Right.
So my advice is virtually to everybody, just like it was in 2000, from 2005, when I predicted the very top of the housing market, when Saturn left Cancer, I said, that's it. And that was July of 2005. And if you take a look at the chart of the housing market, that's the exact top of it.
Wow.
From then, it just collapsed. So the same thing is happening here. We're going to start to see weakness in the housing market and so on. That's all connected. So my advice is at least some of your money should be in cash. It should be in as liquid as you can make it. I'm not saying you got to put it under your mattress, because I don't think the banks are going to go out of business. But let me tell you something. If Obama's people had not made the changes and done what they did in 08 and 09, we may very well have been in the second Great Depression.
Right.
They prevented it. I do not believe that this administration has the minds and the mindset to do it.
Yeah.
What they're doing is deregulating the banks and taking all all of the limiters that the Obama administration put in. They're taking off, so that the banks can do the same thing that they did before. And if you go to Starbucks and you don't realize you don't have money, they can charge you $35 for a cup of coffee.
Right.
So now
that's the Germany in the 30s, the $30 for a loaf, or $300 for a loaf of bread.
Right.
Inflation. Well, let me ask you this: do you see any positive spots in the market now, or between now and 2020? I know we had discussed briefly cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and things like that. Are you optimistic at all about that, or even like alternative energy sources as investments right now?
About a year ago, I was on Coast to Coast, and George Nuri asked me about Bitcoins, and I said to him, it is a scam, and it is going to collapse. And I am telling everybody who's smart, if you have a profit in it, get it out. Cryptocurrencies are not liquid, so sometimes you can't even liquidate your position. Right. Anyway, about 2 months ago, Bitcoins lost 75% of its value.
Yeah.
It completely collapsed. I wouldn't put 10 cents in any of it. It is all unregulated, and once the governments start to regulate it, there's no reason for it to exist. The whole point of it is that it's the Wild West. And they want to, so I'm not a fan of cryptocurrencies. No, I know a couple of financial astrologers who are, and whatever, time will prove who of us is right. But so far, I've been right.
Go ahead. No, I don't.
Alternative energies is the future, and eventually it will. Look at who's doing most of solar energy, the Chinese.
Right.
Because of their government, the Chinese can decide what to do. And what they did was a few years ago, more than a few years ago, they started to burn coal and oil and natural gas as fast as they could, because they needed to enter the 21st century. And now they are changing to alternative energies as fast as they can. Because they understand now they don't have the problems of a government that can argue back and forth and people go to vote. There's no voting in China. This is what it is, and that's the end of it. So they can make these long-term decisions. And Mao did the same thing when he was in power. He had a 20-year plan. I was not a fan of the way he went about doing things, but that's besides the point. Also, when you look at your finances, in my family, we've had AT&T stock for several generations. It pays a nice dividend, and my mother has a nice chunk of it, and it brings in money every quarter. And I would never let her touch it, because it's her income. I don't want to sit and worry about, that my mother can't pay her bills. It's a dividend producing stock, as quite a number of them are. So I look for stocks that are, when I offer trading advice to my clients, most of my clients can't afford to buy several thousand shares of Apple. They don't have $400,000 that they can spend buying stocks. Right. So I look for stocks that are trading at $3, $4, even cheaper, sometimes $10. That way they can buy a few thousand shares. If it goes up $3 or $4, they've made some nice money. I'm also obviously looking into the marijuana stocks very
I was
heavily.
just going to ask you about that. Thank you.
Oh, it's gonna be a big look. What happened was there's a saying on Wall Street: buy the rumor, sell the fact.
Uh-huh.
What that means, obviously, is that, they're going to legalize marijuana. When then the marijuana stocks, there's one in particular I'm looking at, CGC, Canopy. I forget the whole name of the company right now. My mind's moving too quickly. That stock ran up, it almost doubled in price, and as soon as they legalized it, it dropped down.
Right.
Appreciative, because it was built into the market. Now, again, because I did this for so many years, I see the patterns. And I will take the astrology chart of a commodity and then the chart of let's say, a stock, for example. Bill Meridian, a friend of mine, put out an excellent book about the first trade of a stock. Not the company. You're not buying AT&T. You're buying AT&T stock. Mm-hmm. And it's a different entity than the corporation. And I have found it to be long before I ever met Bill, I was using that book on the floor of the exchange because I was fascinated by the idea, and I started to look at it, and I found that there's a great deal of accuracy in that. Mm-hmm. So I look for these stocks, like I said, that either are cheap. Oh, I got people into Nextel when it was trading $3.20. The stock, the chart of the stock itself told me it was going to pop, ran up to $8.60 in 3 months. And I said to everybody, get the hell out. Mm-hmm. They've got 2.5 times their money in 3 months. It's not a bad trade.
Right.
It's the same thing with Rite Aid. I look for these cheap stocks. I'm looking at some penny stocks in marijuana. Now what's going to happen with marijuana is it's going to become legal in America eventually. There's no question about it. The federal government, very slow moving, and the back and forth and conservative and liberal and blah, blah, blah. Marijuana, my next murder mystery has a lot to do with the marijuana business. So I did a lot of research. And it's been medicine in every single pharmacological book in every single nation, going back to ancient China. To ancient Egypt. They used it for glaucoma. That's how long ago they knew what glaucoma was. And the inhalation of the female plant releases the pressure on the eye. So it's only because of William Randolph Hearst and a few other people that marijuana has been illegal for the last 80 years. So eventually it's going to be legalized. And when that happens, then there will be an explosion in marijuana stocks, not just in the growers, but in the vending machine makers and the pipe makers and, even the people who make the banners and the T-shirts. All of this is going to explode. And the business is going to become huge. It could be bigger than oil at some point because it's a worldwide thing, and it's a weed. You grow it, you cut it off. You grow it again.
Right, people can grow their own. But are you recommending people buy into it now or wait?
Well, I don't want to give people, unless they are actually hiring me to help them invest.
Right.
To give out advice, and then somebody comes back and says, "Well, you told me on the radio that I should."
Right.
What I'm telling people is this. I'm looking at all of these marijuana stocks. I am looking for the ones that look like they are run by grown-ups, that have cash behind them. Somebody called me recently and said, I really need a reading, but I'm in real trouble. I've been shorting Apple for the last 5 years. I said to him, are you out of your mind? Mm-hmm. They have more money than God. God calls them up for a loan. And you're shorting Apple? It's ridiculous. They got billions and billions of dollars. I don't care if the stock drops $10, $20. It's a place to buy it. Right. So you have to know how to trade, not just get a little piece of advice from an astrologer. You have to know what you're doing. Right. If you don't know what you're doing,
basically,
go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Mitch, because we're starting to run out of time. So I think this is a perfect segue for you to tell us what you're up to now, how people can reach you if they do want a reading and get advice on their own financial situation, or as you mentioned, you do medical astrology. So can you tell us how people, tell everyone how they can reach you?
My website is mitchastro.com. Okay. And my email is mitchastro@aol.com. I hate AOL, but I've had the name for so long. I have clients who come back to me after 10 years. They say, oh, thank God you still have your email.
Right.
I have a free newsletter that I put out every month, as you mentioned before, Living by Starlight. All you have to do is email me. I'll put you on the mailing list. I do occasionally get political, so every once in a while somebody say, please take me off your mailing list. I like the president and I don't want to hear what you have to say.
Right.
But I talk about all kinds of things in the newsletter, and I go through the aspects for the month, of course. And I'm lecturing December 11th at the Theosophical Society in New York, where I'd like to lecture there. I do lectures a couple of times a year. They're a really nice group. It's a meetup group. I always draw a great crowd. Last time they were sitting on the floor, and there were just too many people there.
Great.
Oh, it always makes you feel good when you sell out.
Send me more info, and I'll publicize it again on before the date. But I am going to have to wrap up now. So it's Mitch Astro at AOL.com?
Or just MitchAstro.com.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you, Mitchell, for being with me.
Thank you, Sherry. It's great always chatting with you. Yeah, me too.
No, same here. So thanks to everyone else for joining us today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please join me next week on November 8th when Carrie Weimer of the Evolutionary Astrology Network joins me to tell us what to expect when the transiting karmic nodal axis retrogrades back into Capricorn and Cancer for the next year and a half. I hope you'll join me then for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to go